This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 2.1, Part B. This is the continuation of the Federalist Era, and we'd left off with the enactment, the imposition of the direct tax of 1798, which was effectively the first property tax in U.S. history. It taxed land, dwellings, and slaves, which constitutes real property. And it was a very unpopular law. It was unpopular, particularly in the southern states. It was intended to raise revenue to help finance and repay the debt. Remember, the United States in its early days was in considerable difficulty because under the Treaty of Paris, the British had agreed to abandon essentially all of their possessions east of the Mississippi. They still had a number of holdings in what would have been then what would have constituted the U.S. Northwest, which would be Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, that area. And they refused to do so because they claimed that the United States had failed to abide by its treaty obligations by repaying the outstanding debt to Great Britain and by compensating the Loyalists, the Tories, for the property they'd lost during the war. In an effort to help address this problem and repay the debt, the Federalists had imposed both a tariff, which would raise a little bit of revenue, and this direct tax. Now, there are some problems with both of these plans. The first of them is that financing a debt at a 4% interest rate is not the same as repaying the debt. Okay, and so that doesn't really fulfill the treaty obligation to finance it. The only way that you can fulfill the treaty obligation is by repaying it at face value. And so, but still, it has a chance of doing it because you'll gradually repay it over time on the proviso that you maintain this stream of revenue from the tariff, and also from the direct tax. Now, the direct tax is going to be short-lived because it's so unpopular. The other problem with the plan is that both the tariff and the direct tax are contrary to the interests of the southern states, and the southern states raise vehement objections to them, and yet they get passed over. And this will lead to the first of the threats of secession from the Union from the South. New England, for its part, will threaten secession because of the Southern objection to repaying the debt in the first place. If you recall what we said last time, the Southern states had no debt. And so by imposing the direct tax and the tariff, they were effectively forcing the Southern states to assume part of a debt that they did not themselves incur. And so they were being forced to pay somebody else's debt, which they didn't like. The New England states will threaten to secede unless the South agrees to it. And so you have already, and this is early on, this is in the mid-1790s, already you have this neonate United States fragmenting and threatening to split apart. The compromise of this will be to move the national capital. The capital originally is in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress had met, and it was the capital during the Revolution. This will be moved. They will create a new capital city that they'll refer to as the District of Columbia in Washington, which at the time is in the South. It's still in the South if you take the South being anything south of the Mason-Dixon line. So it's still in the South on the Potomac River, which is an absolutely miserable place to build a capital. I don't know how many people. I used to live in D.C. I went to Georgetown University when I started graduate school, and I lived in D.C. I didn't live outside D.C. I lived in D.C. on Garfield Street Northwest. And Washington, D.C. is the most miserable place on earth in the summertime. The Potomac River, because of the population and whatever, the Potomac River it just smells horribly. See, what they did was they built this city effectively on a swamp. It's wetlands. It's at the wetlands where the Chesapeake empties out. Okay, that will all empty out into the Chesapeake. Baltimore is the same way. And so in the summertime, with the humidity, and the humidity gets 95% in the summer, and it gets 95 degrees, so it's hot and humid, and all you smell is swamp gas and sewage, and it's just nasty in the summer. But at any rate, That's where they put the capital. Good idea. It actually works out to be it comes back to haunt them when the war between the states breaks out, because that puts the capital of the Union right on the Confederate border, and it will become one of Lee's main objectives. In the war between the states, he'll try it at Antietam and at Gettysburg, but of course we'll get there when we get there. We're now going to for the first time, see what will become a recurring theme through American history. It will be one of the trends that actually leads all the way up to current times. One of the things that is the death of a political party, that will kill a political party, is when the party fragments, when it splits into separate interests. We've already talked about this in the last lecture just a tiny bit, this idea of there being this distinction between the high Federalists and the more moderate Federalists. Well, that split really begins in 1791. It's almost as soon as the party forms, we start to split already. And the split the trigger point for it will be this chartering of the First National Bank, which is Hamilton's baby. It's Hamilton's idea. Madison and ultimately John Adams both will object to this because it invests too much power in the national government to control the supply of money. And this will lead to the basic philosophical rift. And it's a philosophical rift that continues to this day. It's ultimately the rift that will lead to be one of the primary causes of the Civil War. And it's a rift between those who favor a strong national government and those who favor a weaker national government who reserves sovereignty to the states. Hamilton's argument, is going to be based on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, in which it explicitly states that Congress has the right, the authority, to make any laws that are necessary and proper. An extremely liberal, loose phrase. The terminology there grants Congress a great deal of latitude in terms of its legislation. Madison bases his argument on the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution explicitly limits the power of the national government. What it says is anything that is not explicitly given to the national government in the Constitution as a power is reserved to the states. And so we have this distinction. It will ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court, in Marbury v. Madison will be the principal one, but there will be a couple of other decisions that enforce this as well. And so basically you have two different schools of thought. The one school of thought, Hamilton, says that Congress can do anything, can pass any laws that it is not explicitly forbidden from passing. In other words, if the Constitution doesn't specifically restrict Congress from making certain laws, restrict the power of the federal government, then it is implied that the federal government can do that. Madison says, no, Al, that's not how this works. What we've written in the Constitution is only what we've written in the Constitution is only the powers that are explicitly given to the national government. Anything that's not written in there is given over to the states. And so ultimately, like for example, if you bring this all the way up to modern times, read through I encourage you with all of the earnestness at my command. Go online. There's plenty of copies of it. Read the U.S. Constitution. One of the things you'll find odd is that in the U.S. Constitution, the word education never exists. It is a relatively recent phenomenon over the last 30 years or so that the national government has decided to become involved in education. This is not explicitly given to them in the Constitution. But under Article 1, Section 8, it's not explicitly forbidden to them to do in the Constitution. And so we see how this, and that's why I said, that this argument continues to play out between those who favor a strong national government, which would be the Hamiltonian school of thought, and those who favor a little bit more limited national government, which would be the Madisonian thought. In terms of international relations, there are a number of difficulties that come up. We'll deal with them in turn. We'll deal with Britain and we'll deal with Spain. With France, there's not as much, but there will be. First, we deal with native relations, and this deals with what is the northwestern United States, what is modern-day Ohio and Indiana. Okay, the British have maintained their forts there for reasons that we've already talked about. They will use that stronghold to support the native population in their resistance to the United States spreading westward. The United States has an inherent desire to spread westward to the Mississippi River. At the Mississippi River, of course, that begins French territory. Okay, under the Articles of the Treaty of Paris, supposedly the United States was allowed to do that. The British would evacuate. For reasons that we talked about, the British don't evacuate. As the United States begins to spread into Ohio, they run into conflict with the natives. This will ultimately be war with the Miami Confederacy, so named for the Miami Indians. I went to the Miami University of Ohio, which is in southwestern Ohio, is in Oxford, Ohio, not far from the Miami River, and that's where the Indian Confederacy takes its name. And it used to be that the Miami's mascot was I think it was the Miami Indians, but they changed that because it was politically incorrect. I don't know what it is now. I pay no attention to it. Hell, it's been 20 years since I've been out of there. But at any rate, it's an expansion into the Northwest. Now, in 90 and 91, the U.S. military is not particularly well prepared for this. They've gone back to kind of almost the pre-Continental Army days, where you've got just this collection of rabble militias, and as they go out to fight the Miami Confederacy, they suffer some significant defeats and reversals. This will change at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Anthony Wayne is overall U.S. commander at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and he'll launch a relatively bold plan to encircle the Indian populations and win a tremendous victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This will lead to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which ultimately will constitute the first of the many, many, many treaties with the natives that the United States never pays any attention to. The treaty basically says that the Indians will cede the Ohio River Valley. They'll cede what is now the state of Ohio. In exchange, the United States henceforth will not continue to push westward, except if it gets the agreement of the Indians. Typically through the purchase of land was the idea behind this, although that wasn't explicitly stated. And of course, the United States will pay no attention to this. The final upshot of it, we'll see, will be in the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson. In terms of British relations, we want to lay as the background of this that the United States Constitution is ratified in 1789. So the United States as a republic becomes this unified republic in 89. Of course, we had the Articles of Confederation before then, but now we're a unified republic. Well, what we want to remember is that that's the same year the French Revolution takes place. Okay, this will begin the roughly, 1789, 25-year period that is usually referred to as the Napoleonic Wars, the Napoleonic period. Okay, and so Europe is going through a tremendous political upheaval. And what we're going to see is that the United States is going to be used as a kind of a cat's paw between Britain and France, the two main adversaries in the Napoleonic conflicts. And so both Britain and France will attempt to use the United States against their primary adversary. All right. Now, I don't know, and just kind of to use a metaphor, I don't know if any of you have ever had the misfortune of having one of your friends hit you up to move. Okay. Will you move? All right. Okay. Fine. Yeah, I just most recently I had a guy do that. I said, all right, I can help you move. What do you got to move? He says, oh, I just got a couple of boxes and one piece of furniture. Oh, okay, fine. I go over there on a weekend. He has absolutely nothing packed. It's as though he hasn't lifted a single finger to do anything to make this big move. And he has an entire bedroom set, plus an entire entertainment center. Okay? It takes us 2 days to move him. All right? Fine. That's okay. We do that. We do that with our friends because, not just because we're friends, but because, eventually I may have to move and then I'm going to hit you up for help. Sure enough, I was going to move, call him on the phone. Can you help me move? Oh, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. You see, what day are you going to move? I'm going to move Saturday. Oh, I can't do that. I got to work. Well, what if I moved Monday? Oh, no, that's not going to work. My sister's having a baby. Oh, well, they never seem to be available when it comes time to return the favor. Okay, well, this is the Americans and the French. If you remember, the French came in 1778 with the League of Armed Neutrality and began to support the United States. They ultimately will have ground troops there. It will ultimately be de Grasse's fleet that wins the Battle of the Capes that proves pivotal in the final victory in the Revolutionary War. Okay? This is the U.S.-French alliance in the Revolutionary War. Well, now France, immediately upon the revolution taking place in 89, France gets set upon by its European adversaries. Okay? All of them collectively form a league against France and attack. This is something that's usually not remembered, and we'll discuss this a little bit more as we go through the Napoleonic conflicts, even though this is not a course by any means on the Napoleonic conflicts. Napoleon Bonaparte, in his entire military career, only launches one offensive campaign against Russia in 1812. The remainder of them are defensive. Okay, so like what makes Napoleon his name is the campaign in Italy. That's defensive. Okay, that's the Italian city-states began picking off French territories that they held in Italy as a result of the French Revolution and the perception of French weakness. Napoleon was sent down there to stabilize the situation. He ended up conquering northern Italy. Okay, but it was a defensive. Well, okay, at any rate, I digress. At any rate, so now France, hard pressed, comes to its revolutionary brethren. They say, look, U.S., one, we helped you out in your revolution. Okay, well, now we've had our revolution. We are birds of a feather because we are both revolutionaries. Hamilton doesn't see it that way. Okay, to Hamilton, and he's correct on this point, no doubt about it. To Hamilton, there is a significant difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution, and we talked about this at great length when we were there, the American Revolution was instigated and conducted and led by a well-educated, wealthy group of landowners. They were the American elite. If you look at the litany of leadership in the Revolutionary War in the United States, it was a litany of the American elite. Such is not the case with France. The French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, was done by the rabble, by the lowlifes, by the peasants, by the dirt-poor, starving peasants. This was a revolution that came from the bottom up, from the absolute lowest echelon of society. Okay, so there was no similarity there. These were the group that led the French Revolution, that was the vanguard of the French Revolution, are the people for whom Hamilton has nothing but disdain. Okay, these are uneducated, non-wealthy, not landowners, nobodies. So he says this isn't the same. And the second thing he says is, well, you know what? Especially after the rise of the Directorate. The Directorate comes to power in France in the early 1790s, and they're the ones that institute the guillotine. The most famous thing from the French Revolution, of course, probably coming to us from Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, is the guillotining of the cutting the heads off of all the aristocracy. And, in Tale of Two Cities, you have Madame Defarge sitting there knitting everybody's name into her scarf, and it's a brilliantly done by Dickens. It's a brilliantly done book, and you should read it if you haven't read it yet. If you can escape somehow high school without reading Tale of Two Cities, your high school should be lambasted. They should be chastised. You need to read Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of literature ever written. But at any rate, I digress again. But at any rate, so he says, look, your revolution was much more violent. Look at the guillotine. Look at the execution of the aristocracy. Ours was a gentleman's revolution. Ours was handled by elite versus elite. Okay, it was based on philosophical principles. To which, of course, the French say, "Hold on here just a minute. Unless I forget, and we talked about this, unless my memory doesn't serve me, we heard of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty tarred and feathered British tax collectors. Okay, I'm not sure how that puts you on the moral high ground, Al. But at any rate, the U.S. refuses to help France. Okay, and proclaims neutrality. Which brings us to Jay's Treaty. Now, we've talked about the regional divisions that take place. Okay, the U.S. is going to abandon its right to ship to neutrals, to the neutrals, abandon the neutrals' right to ship to nations. Under international law, a neutral power can ship to all participants in a conflict. Okay, the U.S. will abandon that right. The U.S. then grants Britain most favored nation status, meaning it drops the tariffs on British goods. This gives Britain a competitive advantage, particularly against France in the United States. Now, it should be remembered that Madison's approach to trade relations with Britain was entirely opposite. Okay, this is going to be another split within the Federalist Party. Hamilton wants to back Britain. Okay, Britain will compensate the U.S. for ships seized during the Phony War. And during the early period, prior to Jay's Treaty, which comes online in about 1795, prior to that, the United States was making money hand over fist, shipping both to France and to England. The British, from the very get-go of the Napoleonic conflicts, attempt to impose a blockade on France. Well, part of that is going to be in the West Indies, and so the American ships that are shipping to French colonies and to France itself are being intercepted by British ships, okay, and boarded and seized. This ultimately will continue into 1812 and become one of the precipitory causes of the War of 1812. Britain agrees to compensate the U.S. for the dollar value of this. Britain further agrees to abandon its forts in the Northwest, which it ultimately will never do. Britain will grant the U.S. limited trade rights in India and the West Indies, and all of this is contrary to Southern interests. Okay? In terms of, we've talked about terms of trade, and we'll talk about it again. In terms of money out, okay, the Southern colonies benefit from competition among the manufacturers, because that's going to force the price down. By giving Britain most favored nation status, that ends that. Okay? So too, by surrendering the right to ship to all of the players in the war, that cuts France off as a market for U.S. exports, particularly from the South. And so again, this trade policy is effectively protectionistic. It protects British markets and cuts the United States off from French markets, which hurts the South. So once again, we have a federalist policy that contradicts Southern interests. In terms of Spanish relationships with Spain, we have a border dispute, and I mentioned it last time. I mentioned it under the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolution. The Treaty of San Lorenzo is going to establish the border between the United States and Spain. It will establish the border. The United States will be ceded. We had a dispute, if you can remember from last time, there was a dispute in what would be the American Southwest, in what is basically modern-day Mississippi and Alabama, both of which were claimed by Spain, as well as Florida. Well, the Spanish are going to yield that in exchange for U.S. recognition of Spanish control over Florida. So the U.S. is going to give Spain recognition of their control over Florida. Spain will then set the border at the Mississippi River until you hit the Red River. The Red River runs into the Mississippi about midway up through Louisiana. The Red River runs right through Shreveport. And then cuts down to the Mississippi, and they'll draw the line at the Mississippi, and then they'll draw it at the Red River. Okay, so that south of the Red River is Spanish territory. North of the Red River is actually French territory. That's the beginning of that's the southern extreme of the Louisiana Territory. And in addition, it will grant the U.S. in exchange for, again, exchange for Florida, it will grant the U.S. access to the port of New Orleans. When it comes to French relations, we see again the division that takes place within the Federalist Party. Okay, we just talked about Jay's Treaty. Okay, the other wing of the Federalists. This was Jay's Treaty was the brainchild. John Jay was the first Secretary of State. He'll ultimately be the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as well. He serves briefly as Secretary of State. He negotiates this treaty is about all he does, which is why, interestingly enough, Hamilton didn't really like John Jay. And so, interestingly enough, for those of you who've ever been to D.C., D.C. runs with letters. Like there's D Street and E Street and F Street and G Street. There is no J Street in Washington, D.C. There's this interrupt where there's no J Street, and that's one of the arguments behind why they did that was as an affront to John Jay. Who knows? But at any rate, Washington will proclaim U.S. neutrality in the Napoleonic conflicts. Of course, he does so under the inspiration of Hamilton. Washington, as president, never had an original idea in his head. He was effectively the puppet of Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. But this is going to create a division because, as we saw before, Madison was much more prone to siding with France, and he wanted to be actually a neutral. The neutrality of the United States in this early period is in name only. They've given Britain, under Jay's Treaty, they've given Britain most favored nation status. That hardly, and they're going to continue to ship to Great Britain, that hardly constitutes neutrality. And so you're going to have this division within the party. Well, what Hamilton is trying to do, Hamilton is trying to beat the drums because he wants to settle all outstanding issues with Great Britain, one of which could be the debt. Okay? In exchange for U.S. support of Britain, direct intervention in the Napoleonic conflicts, Hamilton's kind of hoping that Britain will maybe let that debt go and abandon their forts in the Northwest. An interesting idea. So he has to beat the drums to try to gain enough support for the United States to directly become involved in this. Well, there's a problem with that. There is a division even within the Federalists over siding with Britain or France. There is a large tangent that has no interest in siding with Britain. There is a large group that believes that, in point of fact, the French revolutionaries do have more in common with the United States. And so they favor more staying in line with France, or at the very least, neutrality. In an effort to gather support, we're going to have one of the more controversial diplomatic incidents in U.S. history that's called the XYZ affair. Now, it should be noted going into this that there is no empirical evidence whatsoever to suggest that this ever took place. All we have is the word of the hearsay evidence, the word of the U.S. diplomats. The U.S. diplomats go over to France to discuss the ongoing dispute, because just as the U.S. was shipping to France in the West Indies and the British were intercepting U.S. ships that had cargo bound for French ports, the French are doing the same thing. The French are intercepting U.S. ships that are bound for English ports. Okay? In what we call the quasi-war. This is in 1798. This is the quasi-war. And the United States sends some diplomats over, led by Ben Franklin, actually, over to France to negotiate these issues with the French. Now, according to the diplomats that go over, they are met by 3 French diplomats who are unnamed. They are referred to as X, Y, and Z. Okay, and according to the American diplomats, X, Y, and Z demand a bribe of $12 million before they'll even discuss anything with the United States. And of course, the U.S. diplomats refuse and come home. And so this becomes an affront, a diplomatic affront to the United States, that France isn't even willing to negotiate over any of these outstanding disputes. And again, I would reiterate, there is no evidence that this incident ever took place. But in response to the quasi-war, the United States will begin the first real expansion of the U.S. Navy. With the international relations that we've just talked about as a backdrop, the United States will pass one of the more controversial laws in U.S. history, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which bear a certain resemblance to the Patriot Act. Okay, and will be subject to the same to a very similar debate to the Patriot Act. We see there are 4 points to the Alien and Sedition Acts. The first of them, excuse me, is the Alien Enemies Act, which stipulates that the president can deport any nationals from enemy countries. Okay, without congressional approval and without being subject to the court's jurisdiction. In terms of the Alien Friends Act, court jurisdiction does play into it. The president can deport any alien suspected of subversive activity. What constitutes subversive activity is open to interpretation, and it's ultimately the court that will make this interpretation. Then you have the Naturalization Act. Now, the Naturalization Act is going to be actually the most controversial and the most politically, well, not the most, but it's going to be that and the Sedition Act are going to be the 2 most controversial. The Naturalization Act is going to be controversial for some very similar reasons. If you remember, what was it, a couple of years ago, last year, the year before that, they proposed, the idea was that to avoid voter fraud in the United States, people that went to vote would have to present a picture ID. And the Democratic Party particularly said, you can't do that, because typically their thinking was that it's the lower echelon of society, the lower classes, socioeconomic classes, that wouldn't have picture IDs. And so by requiring them as a voting requirement, it would essentially deny them the right to vote. And the thinking is that that echelon supports the Democratic Party. So this was seen as a kind of a subterfuge, a rather overt subterfuge, to use an oxymoronic idea, but a rather overt subterfuge by the Republican Party to restrict the voting rights of a group that would clearly support the Democratic Party. The Naturalization Act in 1798 is going to do very similar things. It's going to create stricter residency and citizenship requirements. Well, that's going to affect all of the people coming in, most of the people affected by this would be the lower echelon of society. And of course, we know that the Federalist power base is this highly educated, wealthy elite represented best by Hamilton. Okay? And so the Naturalization Act will restrict the citizenship rights and thereby the voting rights of the lower echelon of society, which benefits the Federalist Party. The Sedition Act benefits the Federalist Party even more, and it's an even more overt act, and it meets with even more criticism. Okay? It makes it a crime to engage in any conspiracy against the government. And of course, what constitutes a conspiracy is again subject to interpretation, the interpretation of the court. Now, we have to understand something, though, that during the 1790s, okay, after the Judiciary Act of 1789 that established this federal judiciary system, the Federalist Party is in power. They're the ones that are making the appointments of judges. And so it's Federalist judges that are going to determine whether or not a conspiracy or subversive activity takes place. And so it's very politically motivated by Hamilton. Okay? In other words, anyone that says anything against the government could be interpreted as engaging in subversive conspiratorial activity and could therefore be censored and ultimately jailed. And that's what we'll have with the Matt Lyon incident. Matt Lyon is a newspaper editor who publishes anti-federalist opinions, okay, critical of the government, and he'll be censored and he'll actually be imprisoned. These will be thrown out relatively quickly once the Republicans take over. As I've mentioned before, and we'll talk about this again, this will become one of the recurring themes. What we see prior to conflict and prior to the uh, destruction of political parties is a polarization. We're seeing now a polarization. On the first part, we see a regional polarization between the North and the South, which we've seen before. This will play out all the way through this epic, and it will play into Epic 3 until we get to the Civil War. The southern states are primarily the ones advocating for states' rights. They're the anti-federalists. The leader of the anti-federalist movement is Thomas Jefferson. He will eventually coalesce this into the Republican Party. You have an economic polarization over trade policy, over the debt, which we've labored over, between debtors and creditors, over the decision to create a national bank. And that was a division even within the Federalist Party. There's further a division over this direct tax of 1798. The direct tax of 1798 was seen as giving a disproportionate amount of the burden to the South, to the benefit of the North. It was going to force the South to help repay Northern debt. Then you have this political polarization. Now, in the early 1790s, under Hamilton's direction, the party will publish the Gazette of the United States, which will be a Federalist published paper and therefore will largely be a propaganda piece, okay, in favor of the Federalist Party. One of the things we'll look at, and we look at it in political science courses more than in U.S. history, is what it takes for a political party to become a viable political force, this group. The first, which we don't have here listed, the first is crystallization. Okay? The first step in forming a political party is crystallization around issues. In other words, you have to get like-minded people together and organize them into a cohesive unit. Then you have to be able to mobilize that group. In other words, you have to be able to move them, literally, okay, to get them active so that they can then affect election results. Okay? Well, the number one way to mobilize them is through mass information. That's what the Gazette of the United States is going to do. And so that's going to further this polarization because the Federalists will have a paper, and under the Alien and Sedition Act, particularly the Sedition Act, nobody's able to contradict that. Nobody's able to publish their own paper. In foreign policy, more and more, we had this split between Madison and Hamilton over the national bank and over the jurisdiction of the national government and the limitations of national sovereignty versus state sovereignty, blah, 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 blah. Well, over foreign policy, John Adams will take over as Secretary of State, and he and Hamilton will have a division over relationships between Britain, France, and the United States. In other words, the United States' role in these ongoing Napoleonic conflicts. Okay, Adams will have as his ally Madison, and will be more of the mind to maintain a more neutral posture or to outright side more with France than with England. Because we have more outstanding, the United States has more outstanding disputes with England than it does with France. The Judiciary Act, which gives the primacy to the national judiciary, and then, of course, these Alien and Sedition Acts, which we just talked about, all of these things are polarizing American society. Finally, we'll see the fall of the Federalist Party. Okay? It begins really with the division in the party between Madison and Hamilton, and will be exacerbated when Adams splits off and forms the political alliance with Madison. So that the second Federalist term, okay, the first, we have Washington serving until 1797, and then Adams will take over as the second president of the United States. After serving briefly as Secretary of State, he'll serve as the president of the United States until 1800. He really represents the contra view to the high Federalists. So he's more Madisonian. Okay, the Hamilton by this point has been politically marginalized. Okay, Adams' first foreign policy initiative is to negotiate the Franco-American Accord, which doesn't really pull the United States into the Napoleonic conflicts on France's side, but it actually is going to strictly enforce neutrality so that the United States will stop supporting, like Britain will lose its most favored nation status. Okay, the United States will not give up on its outstanding disputes with Great Britain, and so it increases tension with Great Britain and decreases tension with France. And of course, as we know, what Hamilton was trying to do was beat the drums to gain popular support to have direct U.S. intervention on the side of Great Britain. This will completely take the wind out of those sails. This will completely discredit Hamilton. And it will be the end of the war scare. It will be the end of the quasi-war with France. Then we have the direct tax of 1798. As we've talked about before, part of the Federalist support, okay, was a group of wealthy landowners, as we've talked about before. Well, these guys are all going to be subject to paying taxes now under the direct tax of 1798. And so the direct tax is going to alienate all the rich farmers, okay? All the rich commercial farmers who backed the Federalist Party. The artisans, okay, which are the craftsmen, they're going to abandon the Federalist after Jay's Treaty because they don't like the provisions in there. Particularly the idea of giving Britain most favored nation status. By giving Britain most favored nation status, you're giving their manufacturers a competitive advantage in U.S. markets. This is at a point where U.S. manufacturing really hasn't gotten off the ground. They're still producing at a very high marginal cost. They haven't developed an economy of scale. So they haven't achieved economic efficiency. And so their cost of production is way higher than their British counterparts. And so this is going to give the British a competitive advantage. So that's going to alienate the manufacturing. And so with those things taking place, the Federalist Party really does not have any kind of popular base anymore. In addition, we've talked about the party division that takes place in the first part between Hamilton and Madison, in the second part between Hamilton and Adams, and then finally, we're going to have Jefferson crystallizing the anti-Federalist movement, okay, those who favor a limited national government, into the first Republican Party. And it should always be pointed out, and I'll point it out again and again, that this has no bearing to the current Republican Party. The current Republican Party is born in the late 1850s, and its first candidate will be Abraham Lincoln. Okay, he will crystallize the anti-Federalists into this and coalesce them into this Republican Party, and then mobilize them through the publication of the National Gazette, okay, which will be highly critical of the Federalists. This will be after the repeal of the Sedition Act, and they'll be highly critical of the Federalists. And, you know, it's kind of one of the as we finish this thing off here, one of the funny notes is we talk about the mudslinging in current American politics as this horrible phenomenon that all candidates do is sit there and say bad things about each other. This is nothing in comparison to the way it was at the beginning of the United States. Okay? At one point, Jefferson will be accused of being a homosexual, okay, as a way of discrediting it. They will sling mud on a personal level, not just on a professional or political level. And finally, we'll have the election of 1800. Adams, who is the Federalist president at that time, Washington having retired from public life, is not a popular person. John Adams, for all of his qualities, is not a charismatic individual. Okay, he lacks the kind of oomph necessary. He got the go because he was essentially handpicked by Washington to replace him, Washington and Hamilton to replace him. But now Adams has pissed off Hamilton. Okay, so whatever support Hamilton had, he pulls away from Adams, and that splits the party still further. They try to coalesce themselves between Aaron Burr, under Aaron Burr, who ultimately will be the one that fights a duel with Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson will run against him. Neither of them achieve a majority in the Electoral College, and so this will be the first election that's decided by the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will put Thomas Jefferson in office, because by this point the Federalists have lost their control over the House, and this will begin the Republican era, and this ends PowerPoint 2.1. In PowerPoint 2.2, we'll begin our discussion of the Republican era.